Welcome to week number 2. That's right, folks. We got week 1 in the books. Hopefully, you're able to get everything ready, all that stuff answered. Basically, looking at what is culture. Now, culture is a huge thing when it comes to humanities classes because it explains why. Because it's why they believe the things they did. Why did they say the things they did? Why did they eat the things they did or dress the way they did? Culture is everything that makes an area special, that makes an area different from anything else, a time period different than anything else. It's what makes those people special. And that's why in these humanities classes, we're going to look at the culture in all the even wheats, and then look at the art of that culture in all the odd wheats, and then just put them together to determine, does it make sense that the art that we see reflects the culture that happened? And the best part is you can see it time and time and time again. So this week, week number 2, we're going to start with medieval culture, the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages, the medieval, however you want to describe it, is between the collapse of Rome and the start of the Renaissance, 400 to 1300-ish. Once again, every date is going to change based on where you get your research, what your opinions are, what your perspectives are. So basically, as long as you're coming up with a good idea and backing it up with your thought process and evidence, you're making an impact on history, and that's so completely awesome. Another way of describing the Middle Ages is calling them the Dark Ages, because there was a major void in power. There wasn't that all like the Roman Empire that dominated the landscape. When it fell, all these areas that were once the Roman Empire were their individual people. So, yes, they had kings and queens and they had their rulers, but it wasn't a major power. In fact, the only real force was the Catholic Church. The Pope was the supreme ruler, but it was in that very religious sense. And we'll see how that kind of plays in with other cultures, other arts, and other ideas. The populations were moving around. They're like, where should they be? Should they be part of this country, that country? And the governments were very feudal states, as in the kings, the nobles, the lords had the money, had the power, and everyone worked for them. It was a great way to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. A feudal state has that very like proper division of the classes, and it allowed those who had the power, even though there wasn't a major power, but had the power to rule, to stay ahead, to make sure they didn't have to do the hard labor works. So when we look at the Middle Ages, kings, knights, and castles probably rule everyone's mind. A Knight's Tale is a beautiful movie. It's so awesome. And it shows kind of some of the main ideas of what the Middle Ages were all about. And while it was focused on jousting and kind of like the rise of somebody, it was that clear, hey, or William was that nobody, so he had to pretend to be a knight, a nobleman, and when he was found, like, even though he rose to that fame of jousting, when they found out he wasn't a knight, a noble, they like booed him and pushed him away. So kings and queens took power and ruled over the territories. They kept everyone in line with nobles, with money. They are the ones who had the army, had the money, had the rich friends, and they claimed to rule because it was God's will to rule. That was going to help them big because you got to remember, whether you are religious or not, back in the Middle Ages, religion dominated the landscape, religion dominated lives. And so if the king had God's will to rule, then everyone was like, well, that makes sense. They should rule. And so they used their money, they used their friends, they used their armies to make sure no one else was gonna try to rise up against them. And this is where we start seeing kings like King Louis in France, the King Henry in England, and everything in between. Knights were heavily armored soldiers. So they were prestigious because the Knights Orders were founded, the Knights Templar and stuff like that. They were just basically an upper class soldier. They got to ride the horses, they got the better armor, they were kind of like nobles who went to fight in war. They became rich thanks to pillaging and the places they fought. So basically, they would want war to take place because once they conquered an area, they could ransack the town and take any of the riches and goods they wanted, forcing others to just kind of fall in line and allowing them to have more money, more ideas, and then at that point, more power as well. Knight derives from an old English word meaning servant. They serve the king. So they were the king's army. They were the nobles, they were the rich people who helped serve the king in the sense that they made sure the king stayed rich, and the king made sure that the people he brought in or made knights were proper knights as well. Castles, they were just those cool homes and good protection. They were probably extremely cold. If you look at how they were built out of the stone. They were huge places. They didn't have the electricity like we do today. So it was probably a pretty cold, damp area, but the places they kept nice were pretty cool. Features of castles were used to keep the king and queen protected and happy. So the moats, the drawbridges, the different towers, those all served purposes in keeping the king. The most famous king of all of this time period. Well, maybe not the most famous, but the one who probably got the world out of a dark age was Charlemagne. You can see when we talk about his empire, he he became that huge ruler and took over that void of power. Let's go back. There we go. So we don't really know when he was born. 747 question mark. So 747-ish. And then he dies in 814. Charlemagne becomes king of the Lombards, king of the Franks, and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So now all of a sudden he's getting those titles. He is becoming larger than life and is making everyone else kind of like bow down to him. He was a he was son of Pippin the Third, and Pippin was the an early king. Didn't have all those titles, but an early king because he had good ties to the Catholic Church. Now that's going to be key during this time period is who's connected to the church and how can they help each other. So Pippin the Third is ruling the area, and when he dies, it's like, all right, my two sons, Charlemagne and his brother, let's split the power. Why don't you guys work together? Well, that if you've ever studied history, if two brothers have to share power, it does not work at all. And in 771, the brother dies and Charlemagne takes all the power. It's not a, oh no, my brother died, we'll pass it on to his kids. And then it's like, Charlemagne's, it's mine. And he started to blend old traditions with the new. He was that kind of like a nice transition area. New challenges, old traditions to allow the people to grow and get the people to follow him because he wasn't a rigid ruler. He was able to see what was going on and bring in those different ideas to make sure that it was going to be as best as possible. And spent many years conquering to solidify his throne. And as he opened that up, as he walked through his throne, or solidified his throne and walked through the area, people started to see him and he started to set up governments, counts, bishops. It was a way for him to rule all this area but yet not be there. You can't be more places at once. So he set it up where they allowed him to be emperor, to be king of the kings, and his nobles, his counts, his bishops, the people he trusted most would be in those day-to-day smaller areas. So he was that king that kind of brought back the idea of the division of power, and he brought back that idea of I'm gonna rule large areas. He renewed the Roman Empire when he protected Pope Leo from invaders. So the Holy Roman Church, the Catholic Church in the Vatican City, in Rome, or right there with Rome, and they've been attacked and attacked and attacked. It's one of those where they needed help and kind of they were still powerful, but a little weakened. And so Charlemagne lended his support, lended his help, and Pope Leo's like, yes, and rewarded him well, naming him Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So if you look at this picture, you can see his crowning and how with the crosses, with the crowns, and the nice big throne. At 72 years old, or give or take a few years, his son takes over, or he dies, and his son takes over. And that's when we start seeing the like dissolving into nothing. As you'll see repeated throughout history, time and time again, we'll see that it's just kind of like a king rises up, does great things. Maybe his firstborn son continues that legacy, but then it slowly dies out because the sons become privileged. They become me, me, me. They become corrupt and forget about the people, forgot what gave them the throne. During the Middle Ages, especially near the end, one of the biggest things was the Black Death, the bubonic plague. In October in 1347, ships docked in Sicily. The ball tip of the boot of the Italy boot. When the ships docked, most aboard were already dead, and the ones who were living were like should have been dead type of thing. It was that you're swelling in all your lymph nodes and your nodes, your blood and pus seeped out everywhere. You had terrible fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible aches and pains. It was a miserable, miserable disease. It spread through air, fleas, rats. It was the opening of that Silk Road trade as well. So those trading with all these different nations that you're probably not used to, that all of a sudden introduced new diseases, new things, and if your body doesn't know how to fight it, it broke, like it just breaks down. In 5 years, within 5 years, that's it. It kills 1/3 of the population. 20 million people gone. That's how fast it spread. And that's kind of how you can look at their culture too, in the sense that the hygiene wasn't the best. Overcrowded cities. You can look at medicine was making jumps, but not the best jumps. Because does the Black Death end? Does the bubonic plague end? Yes, but also no. Because it's still a disease. People can still get it today. However, it's not as bad. So how did we go from killing 1/3 of the population to steadily out and the population rising again? Well, isolation, quarantine, washing your hands, not allowing the sewer to run through the streets, making sure the dead aren't just sitting around and rotting in the streets, but taken away to a cemetery. So you can see once they realize that this disease is a disease, they started to, hey, let's isolate ourselves. Let's quarantine ourselves. Let's get out of these crowded cities. Let's not be right beside everybody. Let's cover our mouths when we cough. And we've seen it through pandemics, through major illnesses throughout history too, is once they started to do those things, the disease became manageable, becomes less deadly, becomes easier to recover from. So a major point, a major event in the Middle Ages was the Black Death. The other, the good old Crusades. Religious wars between 1096 to 1291. Now, were we fighting all those years? No. All right, they would rise up, fall back, rise up, fall back. And there were many, many crusades that took place. You got to remember at this point, the main power was the Catholic Church. And just like any other entity or person who has power, they don't want to give it up. And who was rising during this time? The Islamic faith. The Muslims were not following the Catholic Church teachings, and there became that major, major rivalry. And when it says war for the Holy Land, is you got to think about it. Judaism, Christianity, and Muslims or Islamic faith all start in this very similar area of Jerusalem because all of them have ties, deep, deep ties to that area. And everyone thinks they should, like, especially at this time, they believe that it's theirs by right. They should have it. So Pope Urban II starts these religious wars off by asking for mercenary troops. He was like, we need to go back and get the Holy Land. It was that huge message, propaganda, promotion of this is God's will. He wants us to have it back. We need to kick out the Muslims and go. Well, the fighting was constantly back and forth. And like I said, many took place. First, the Christians would grow and attack, then the Muslims would attack, then someone would try to attack, then the others would try to rise up, but then the attack would fail. And it was back and forth, back and forth. And while it ultimately ends with an Islamic victory, the amount of killing, the amount of um like destruction that took place really doesn't bring out victories. Except with the trade and travel. Now all of a sudden people, and this kind of leads to the Renaissance, right? People are starting to, well, if we're going to fight the war, we need war supplies and we need to get it to them. So new trade routes are being discovered, new ideas are being passed along the countries to get from point A to point B. New people are talking to people they've never met before about different ideas about what makes the world better, what they need to do to help themselves. So as trade's increasing, new ideas are there. Now all of a sudden it's like, wait a second. How about we make this thing easier to do? Or how I see your invention, let's tweak it a little bit and make it even better. And with trade increasing, so does travel because people are being curious about new parts of the world because the soldiers do return and they talk about the places they've been to. The people hear about the Holy Land far away and they're like, well, maybe, just maybe we want to do and see what these places are. And as they start getting curious, the Renaissance, rebirth, rediscovery, re or making new ideas is starting to come out and be like, ooh, what's that? Ooh, how can we make it there? And the idea after idea after idea of just growth and new. And so, even though the Crusades, terrible destruction, they did help out the world in a little bit in the sense that trade and travel go up, which always benefits because new people are talking, new ideas are being brought forth, and new eyes are looking at old ideas. So that is the Middle Ages in a nutshell. Like I said, we could go on forever and ever about all this stuff, but I want you to do some research on your own about what you think the Middle Ages culture was. Find a couple articles write your opinion, write your perspective, aka bring in that new idea from new people, aka you, and add to what the medieval time periods was all about. If you have questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, good luck.